Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to be entirely devoting our show to Aliyev's invasion of Armenia this week. Let's talk about some of the specific updates or the things that we know. We know that during the first day of the war, our air defense installations were targeted. Many of them were destroyed. Our weapons depots were attacked across the country. Significant civilian infrastructure was deliberately attacked by the Aliyev regime, and our military barracks. The fighting has gone on for 3 days, and it ended last night at 8 p.m. in a ceasefire that was brokered by the European Union, it looks like, mostly, and the United States, which seems to be the leading role in creating a ceasefire. There's obviously many things about a war that we do not know. We've been actually very reluctant to report things as far as who's doing what where, because you constantly hear contradictory things, and obviously there's propaganda and lying going on everyone's part. So I don't want to get into the exact analysis of where everything is at. We will have a much better view over the next couple of weeks and days. But there's a couple of things that are very clear to me, which are distinctly different from the incidents of the last year, is that our guys fought. We didn't have any of those embarrassing incidents that we had last year of people coming up to the border and then leaving because they didn't have proper guidance or orders. Our guys have fought like hell across the board. And what we also know from video evidence is that they've killed significant numbers of enemy troops. And in fact, what we know of the first 50 of Aliyev's gunmen that died, more than 80% of them were either officers or came out of their special forces once you match them from open sources to who they are and where they come from. Let's move on to what the response of different parties that are relevant in the world and our government has been to this aggression. Let's start off with our friends in the EU, who by far has given the most disgraceful statements in response to this very clear violation of international law and aggressive war, which is actually the highest form of crime in international law. What we have from the EU across the board are, with the exceptions of a few countries like Cyprus, are these both-sided statements, like this was some clash that started and not an actual invasion or attack on sovereign Armenian territory. When I was seeing all these statements, I was reminded of Mr. Borrell in a G20 summit in Indonesia, was actually complaining that Europe is actually losing the PR war to Russia about Ukraine. Well, Mr. Borrell, this is why you're losing the PR war. There's a very simple phrase for it. It's called hypocrisy. In fact, there's actually a decent case to be made that what triggered this war or enabled it was the visit of Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, who visited Baku to sign this phony gas deal, which will take, on the best case scenario, with the gas that's available from Aliyev's state to the EU from 1% to 2% of use, which is essentially meaningless in the big scheme of things when you're trying to replace Russian gas, which provides 40% of the gas that's used in the EU. I do not know what she thought that a regime like Aliyev's was going to take from a visit that legitimizes his country and his regime. That was as close to a green light as you can get for aggression as Aliyev has gotten over the last few months. Now let's move on to the United States reaction, which was fascinating and quite interesting because the United States initial statements were very much of the European Union two-sided statements, and over the last 2 days, they've actually moved closer and closer and closer into calling out who the aggressor is and who the victim is, not to the extent that was satisfactory from a political or moral perspective, but there was actually a deliberate and very systematic shift that was quite noticeable. What we also have, which is interesting, is that the ceasefire that was brokered last night was not brokered by Russia. It was actually brokered by the United States. And what we saw, and this also had French involvement in it, is that two countries were using the vacuum that was created by the Russian position or the lack of involvement or the lack of help for Armenia to position themselves in brokering this deal and to fill the vacuum that the Russians, either for obvious or cynical reasons, had created. Let's move on to Russia's response and CSTO's response. CSTO obviously being the local equivalent, the poor man's version of NATO in our region, which is essentially, Russia in so many ways. Their response was frankly disgraceful. The response of this treaty organization that is supposed to defend this country is to say that we're working with both sides to end this war. That is their response. And that they're sending a fact-finding mission. Like, you don't know that the war has started. You need to send someone to find out that there's actually fighting going on. This is absurd and it's absolutely ridiculous. And the one thing that we have seen over the last few days is the mood in this country turning very much distinctly in an anti-CSTO, anti-Russian direction, because they are seen as having systematically failed this country. And frankly, at this point, we have to, if that's their position, and we should take it for what it is, we should move on. We don't need to come out of the treaty organization because it's a meaningless thing anyway. But we need to look at new partnerships and definitely new places and new countries to buy weapons from. That is obviously what is important to us, whether we buy weapons from the West, we buy it from India, we buy it from China, we buy it from Iran. Nobody has any right to tell us who we deal with on the defense sector when it comes to defending this country, because the only people that are actually defending this country are Armenian soldiers on our borders. So no one should have any say in this. And as far as CSTO is concerned, for all practical purposes, we should consider them null and void. Now let's move on to the response of this government in Armenia, and specifically the Prime Minister over the last few days. He's made multiple speeches, Facebook Lives, and different things. It's very hard to put all of it together because it's a lot of material. Obviously, he did all the things that he needed to do as far as praising our troops and the performance that they've put up, which is far superior to what we've seen in the past. He, in a speech to Parliament, he talked about purchasing weapons, that there's countries that are selling us, that are willing to sell us weapons, and there's countries that aren't willing to sell us weapons, and there's countries that are actually interfering with us buying weapons, which leads you to the obvious conclusion is you have to find a way to make this work and buy weapons from anybody that is willing to sell to us as we develop our own at the same time. He talked about his desire to sign a peace agreement at some point again, which is foolish given in the context but we were dealing with a war yesterday. Talk like that is completely pointless when our people are on the front fighting and dying. He also talked about spending, massively upgrading our military spending to spend $12 billion over the next 10 years in purchasing weapons and upgrading the army, which is all good. And the final thing that he said, which is he drew a red line, and the red line was the territorial integrity of Armenia, specifically Soviet Armenia. And he said that is his red line. And he said that the only corridor that has ever been discussed is the corridor to Artsakh, and that there will be no sovereign corridor to Nakhchivan from Azerbaijan proper. Now let's move on to analyzing the sort of the events of the last couple of days, the winners and the losers of what has gone on for the last 3 days. And I think we need to be very careful here, is because there's a lot of caveats, there's a lot of moving parts. Who appears to be the winner today could actually look different 3 or 4 days from now or 3 or 4 weeks from now. But we can only judge by what we know today. And by judging what we know today, the biggest winner of this conflict so far has been Ilham Aliyev, for multiple different reasons. First of all, he managed to break a very big red line, to do a massive attack on sovereign Armenian territory, to actually invade sovereign Armenian territory, which is the highest crime in international law, to kill hundreds of Armenian soldiers and civilians and occupy parts of Armenia. We don't know what extent, we'll find that out. It could be small, it could be minor, or it could be more than they're telling us right now. He has actually started what we can call the Gazification of Armenia, in which we can see incidents like this once every couple of months, and it'll become normalized. And it'll be always in the context or some border clashes rather than this continual aggression on his part. He has proved that a West that is in general more than willing to destroy its economy to punish the Russians for their invasion of Ukraine will not punish him for doing exactly the same thing that is going on in Ukraine. And in fact, not only they won't stop him, they won't even call it aggression, and they won't call him out on it for the most part. The other thing that he has done, he has shown CSTO and the Russians to be entirely useless and incapable of defending, or more importantly and more precisely, unwilling to defend Armenia. But this actually goes both ways, because this is a lesson that we've also learned. So sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. And he's also proven that despite what they say, our government really has no red lines when it comes to its quest for peace at any cost. Now we're going to move on to analyzing the current state of relations between Armenia and the Aliyev regime. I want to dwell on the government's position in regards to its dealings with the regime in Baku and the negotiations that are going on and have been going on. And what do we know about them? And let's try to understand what both sides want in this case. What the Baku regime wants is universally two things: an ethnically cleansed Artsakh without any Armenians. That's one. Two, a weak and disarmed Armenia that can be pushed around at will. Those are their two universal goals. Their negotiations are simply all tactical to get to those goals. If they can achieve them militarily, they will try to achieve them militarily, unless we can stop them. If they can achieve it diplomatically, they're going to try to achieve it diplomatically. This cycle of aggression will go on until the day where the military aggression has a greater cost to the regime in Baku than the cost of peace. That's the only thing that's going to change their attitude. What they want specifically in the short run is two things. One is to essentially destroy the Artsakh defense forces, to make Artsakh essentially defenseless. And this is a constant demand that's coming up, that the Artsakh defense forces need to be disarmed, their heavy weapons need to be taken away. And what we need to see this for what this is what I call Srebrenica in waiting. What they want to do is to create a situation where you have 100,000 Armenian civilians which have no way of defending themselves, surrounded by genocidal armies in all around them, and these thin, unreliable Russian peacekeepers that will not be able to protect the civilians against this genocidal army. The second thing that he clearly wants is the sovereign corridor to Nakhchivan, which is always talked about, and it's something that even this government says it has absolutely no interest in giving in on. So those are their immediate plans. What Armenia and the international community wants out of these negotiations is peace, established borders, open transportation, and an overall settlement of this conflict. The problem is that all of these goals that Armenia and the international community have are against the interests of the Baku regime. They do not serve the interests of the regime. That's why they will do everything possible not to have any of these things come to pass. That is why, in essence, the entire negotiating process that we have seen and we're going to see in the future is actually a farce, or more precisely, political performance art. Because one side, in fact, the entirety of the world, is interested in peace in this region, and one party and one man specifically is not. Except what matters in this case is the fact that that one man is not interested in peace. Now let's move on to what I call the peace at any cost camp in Armenia. There's this idea out there that we can have this universal peace in our current conditions if we are willing to give in on things that we traditionally would not. And this is the reality of it. Even if we were to capitulate to all of the demands of the Aliyev regime, and the Prime Minister is always talking about there's no alternative to peace, and again, I admire him for seeking peace. Even if we give in to all of those demands, that will not bring peace. For a simple reason, as we had stated, it doesn't serve the interest of the regime in Baku. The best example of this is one simple fact. Everything that Aliyev has ever signed, everything that he has ever agreed to, he has violated. Almost every point in the November 9th agreement, or many of the ones that matter, he has violated every single one of them. So if you think he signs a peace agreement What makes you believe that he's going to actually live up to his commitments? Secondly, transportation corridors will not open. The rail lines will not open for one specific reason, because transportation systems opening up in this region are far more beneficial to us than they are to the Aliyev regime. The only caveat here is if there's an outside force, for example, like Russia, that's for its own purposes, forces everyone to open up its transportation corridors. And at this point, I don't see that Russian willingness or actually political will exist to be able to force its way around. Let's move on to the demarcation of the borders. What's going to happen? Let's say we demark the borders. What makes you think that once it's been clear that there are large areas of Armenian territory that are actually right now occupied by the Aliyev regime, what makes you think that they're going to withdraw from any of them? They will not. They will sit there and go, okay, you want us to leave? Make us leave. That will not bring us peace. And after we have conceded everything that they want right now, they will simply come back with more demands. They'll come back and talk about Soviet enclaves. They'll want this, they'll want that. And they will do all of this to make sure that there's not a peaceful settlement of this problem. The only solution in this case, the only one that matters, is to rebuild our military forces, to build a garrison state. And we need to do this in visible and loud ways. They need to know that we're rearming and that we're willing to defend ourselves, as we did over the last 3 days, for the most part, from what we can see, fairly successfully. As far as the Prime Minister and his current government are concerned, this is what we can say. It's simple. At this point, you're no longer the heroes of the revolution, but the humiliated leaders of a nation that simply refuses to be humiliated. Unless you take it upon yourself and use all means necessary to rebuild the defenses of this country, make it the 1, 2, and 3rd priorities of the state to strengthen the country so we can actually negotiate peace from a place of strength, your government is not going to last. Just like in nature, politics abhors weakness and only favors the daring and the strong. We could not conclude this show without talking about our heroes that have been fighting at the borders the last 3 days, and the communities that have been affected, and the civilians that have been fighting to defend their homes and their lands. To those that we lost, may God bless your soul, and we will be eternally, eternally grateful to you. And for those soldiers that we have that are still there on the front lines, and they have fought valiantly, successfully, and hard to defend this country. What you might have accomplished, and we will know more about this, is you might have actually blown up the schemes of multiple evil men around the world that had schemes that they were trying to put across that you foiled by the way you defended this country, and you did not allow the enemy to reach her objectives. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insight.
Երազիմ երկիր հայրենի, հոգսերդ շատ հույսդ մեծ, քարքարով